Good afternoon, Bible Smack audience. Alright, today we're going to go on to the next section of this apologetic series that I'm kind of going through. We really kind of went through the gambit with secularism. We talked about the presuppositions that kind of go in with that and how they can't really have any foundation in absolute truth. And then we started looking at these presuppositions to evolution, and we started kind of like showing how, Christianity does have proper presuppositions to do science, and most of the sciences were founded by Christians. And we went through, some evidence for creation and evidence against evolution. But now, I want to focus a little bit on the other side of things. We talked about, secularism, but what about the world of religion? Well, we go back and we look at the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas as he developed this dualistic point of view of faith and reason. And with, really it was cutting apart, it was a dissecting the word believe, from the positive faith to the negative skepticism. And so now we've looked at the problems with skepticism. I want to talk about the problems with fideism, okay, this new understanding of faith. Because what he did was he said, well, not everybody agrees. Everybody agrees with the existence of God and morality. And he's really kind of talking about himself with the Catholics and the Muslims. But not everybody agrees about the resurrection, the Trinity, the atonement. Those are things that are strict to Christianity. So he says, well, those things are faith. These things are just reason. Well, that definition of faith pretty much summarizes the understanding of religion with all the world religions. Okay? When they think of faith, they do not think that faith is constructed in a real, it's not accountable to the laws of reason. It's not accountable to evidence and research and things like that. It's just something that we need intuitively. And that kind of goes into a philosophy and a spirituality that we call mysticism. Mysticism, obviously, it's about the mystery. It's something that we can't grasp because there are basic needs that we have that are not solved by skepticism and rationality. When we talk about love, and I'm not just talking about when we talk, because they could say, well, love is just sexual. But there's something that's a higher form of love. When they talk about morality, when they talk about worship, there's all these internal things that we have that are intuitive and it's part of our reality, but it's just not meshing with a skeptical worldview. So, what is it? Well, the word faith is reconstructed in world religions to be something that comes from us. And that's the problem. We have this reason and rationality in science, and the problem is not as much that it's reason or it's rational. The problem is that it's coming from us and that we're limited. So on the other hand, what about faith that comes from us? Well, that becomes limited too, and then it gets redefined into what we call imagination or mythology or myth. You see, we have these needs that are apparent. We can't solve them rationally, so there has to be an irrational element. And the first time that really gets put into strict philosophical terms is with the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard. And Soren Kierkegaard, he's famous for that phrase, the leap of faith. I can't, explain everything in the universe materialistically or rationally. So I have to transcend that, and this is where it is equal to mysticism and its practices. And there are many Christians that practice mysticism too, and that is still irrational, okay? And that's what we have to figure out. I've kind of made a good case in my previous videos for the Christian religion based off experience and based off the fact that all the forms of secular knowledge are so limited and they're not objective. But in doing that, what we have to kind of come to that conclusion to is how do we judge which Christianity is true, and if Christianity is the only religion that's true. There's many Muslims and many Buddhists who've had their own existential experiences. And this is where Kierkegaard's existentialism comes in. They say, well, there's the objective reality, which is terrible. It's just materialism. You live, you die, you're done. And then there's that need for something subjective. And in that subjective truth, if it's even truth, we find this world of faith in a mental subjective reality, in a dream world, and something that's fantasy in nature. But those things have to be under some sort of idea of rationality. In fact, that's what Kierkegaard's doing. He's trying to make the irrational rational. And that's what the normal earthly religious man has to do. So, they go through that paradigm and, they try to understand things, and it has to go by the laws of logic. There's a famous Indian Christian philosopher named Ravi Zacharias, and Zacharias would say that, while the Hindus believe that, reality is an illusion, an Indian man is still going to jump onto the sidewalk if he's about to get hit by a bus. It's got to make sense. It can't be something that's stupid. So, there is some accountability for the religious world. We're not just trying to get into some sort of weird fideism like existentialism is. Christianity in the biblical form, because there's many non-biblical forms of Christianity, is factual. I was going through the account of Genesis, and when you look at Genesis chapters 1 through 12, after a while, a lot of it's going to get boring. And if it was a myth, it would not be boring. It would be irrational, but it wouldn't be boring. But yet we have genealogies and descriptions of when the waters went up and when the waters went down and how the heavens broke open and exactly how many days this took and how many days that the waters settled and how many days the waters assuaged. Why is it taking all that time and all that detail? Kids, when they complain about the Bible, kids are not complaining that the Bible's irrational. They're complaining that it's boring. Why is it boring? Because it's factual. And because it's taking so much detail and history into it. But you don't see that through the other religions. What you see historically is that the most ancient of peoples start out with a monotheism. And then gradually they start talking about, well, this is the God of Matt. Or that's the God of Jeremy. Or that's the God of Jeff. Well, then all of a sudden, those different descriptions become different gods. Okay? Well, then all of a sudden you say, well, there's not only a couple different understandings of God, there's a couple different gods. And I once talked to an African spiritualist, and they said that, there's God as represented in the wind, there's God as represented in the earth. You see, they start that and they branch out, and basically, the idea of one God falls apart and splits into polytheism. Polytheism, though, does not make sense. The closest thing is panentheism, and we'll get that in a second. But polytheism has multiple gods. What's wrong with multiple gods? Well, if you have different gods, they're all powerful. And yet they all, in these mythologies, they all fight each other and get into it. Well, that's irrational. Because if they're all powerful, they're not going to stop each other. Okay? And they're not going to hurt each other. So how does anything take place? Okay? That, basically that's, A cannot equal non-A. That's the law of non-contradiction. To have several gods and several personalities of God, these different gods, bam, Totally irrational. And the philosophers, especially under Plato, realized and recognized that fact. And they were ashamed of their polytheism. And that's why in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul talks about the altar to the unknown God. Because he was shaming them for their religiosity. That the people had gotten into all this kind of ritual, all this kind of superstition. Okay? So polytheism breaks apart, and either you go back to monotheism, or you go into pantheism. And pantheism kind of sees that these gods are now smaller G gods, and they're not really all-powerful. They're like deities. But there has to be a guiding force, and that guiding force is not a person at all. It's just all of nature. It's just everything. But everything does not have a person. It does not have a purpose. And so you still have this chaotic, purposeless universe. So how do we get past those things? Well, you know, they try with panentheism, where there's a head god like Zeus or Jupiter. But at the end of the day, you still have this irrationalism going through and just poisoning everything. So then when we look at these other things, like in Hinduism, they start saying that everything is an illusion and nothing is real. And that's where you start getting into insanity. And you start getting into some weird practices. And that's why those societies have had so much chaos. Because if reality is really an illusion, then what really matters? You know, there's no more accountability. Even moral accountability gets screwed up because it's not dealing with a person in their reality. They're dealing with the next life and the life after that.